Hello, everyone. My name is Alistair Ballantyne, and you are listening to The Big Soup. Today it is episode 10, which we're calling The Great Spiritual Reset. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. The recording of this episode is taking place on the day of the full moon eclipse in Pisces. For those of you working with the tropical zodiac, as which I am one of those people, the Great Spiritual Reset is something that has come to mind quite often as we had the Saturn in Pisces transit, which was March 2023 to May 25. Saturn has gone retrograde into Pisces. The full moon eclipse is in Pisces, conjunct the transiting North Node in Pisces, trine Jupiter in Cancer. Also, not only is it all of these things for the collective, but for me personally, it's conjunct my midheaven, so it's get to work, Buster, and it's also trine my Saturn in Scorpio, which, it's time to say some things and put some structure on this, because with the Saturn in Pisces transit, we were seeing a lot of drive for accountability, evolution of practice, making things more ethical, making things more grounded and accessible and relatable when it came to the domain of spirituality, particularly spirituality online, on social media, all of this kind of thing that had blossomed through the era of Neptune in Pisces, which started in 2012 and went through to earlier this year. Now, what I find interesting is when we're talking about outer planets and social planet transits, the outer planets are Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Social planets are Jupiter and Saturn. We're starting to tap into waves of the collective energy and waves of the collective consciousness. And for me, I'm always quite interested in these transits because part of my personal practice is about finding how the individual resonates within the collective. So our outer planet transits can point to energy that is flowing through the collective unconscious, lessons that we need to learn as a society. And then social planets, we're kind of bringing those down a little bit closer to see how we'll be affecting on maybe not as broader scope level, but in terms of like our people who are grouped together by certain ages. Because with the social planets, Jupiter is 1 year per sign and Saturn is 2.5 years per sign. So we can see those kind of zeroing in on our closer age groups there, whereas with Uranus, it's 7 years of transit, Neptune is 14, and Pluto, because it's elliptical orbit, it varies between 10 and 20 years. So when we had Saturn rolling into Pisces in March 2023, it was asking us to really focus on what spiritual practices hold water. How are we bridging between the realms of the seen and the unseen? And what's actually relatable, what's actually relationable, what can we action, what takes into account that every one of us is having a very different experience on this earth, depending on where we were born, the communities that we're part of, the locations that we live in, our personal beliefs, structures and values, and the lineages of our families. And I find this quite interesting because a lot of the spirituality that rose up through the Neptune in Pisces era, I struggled to connect with. And for me, it just seemed like it couldn't really hold a lot of water. Now, as always, this is some, not all. And when we take a more critical view of things, we try to be compassionate as well, because we can spare any compassion when it comes to exploitation, particularly intentional exploitation. But a lot of the Neptune in Pisces era was exemplified by delusion and monetized delusion at that. So when Saturn rolled into Pisces in 2023, something that I observed quite a lot, particularly in the online spiritual community, was weapons grade meltdowns. The same was true of the online business community as well, because around about the time of that transit kicking off, I'd managed to get myself out of a cult-like group around online business, which as the theme of Saturn in Pisces going through and its reflections and, looking at where things need to be more grounded and more measured and more actionable, I had to really do a lot of unpicking over that time in terms of being a service provider and a freelancer and someone who works for themselves in the business of spirituality, well-being, personal development and growth and all of these other things. So it was an interesting experience because leading into that, I'd joined that group with a view of like, how can I put myself out there in this way? How can I get some help to package and present myself in a way? And a lot of the things that I was advised to do before that transit really didn't resonate, and really felt like I was amplifying things that supposedly made me sound more interesting, but actually these were the things that were kind of deeply personal, and I didn't see them as selling points. I saw them as things that had informed my path rather than things that needed to be put out front and center. And that was a very big contrast between Neptune in Pisces and Saturn in Pisces, that we've got particularly with Neptune, we can have this very broad, boundaryless vision and scope, but we can also find ourselves lost at sea. And the difference between those two perspectives and points of observation can be somewhat like a razor's edge, depending on how we're looking at the whole thing. So it's been an interesting journey through that transit, not just professionally, but personally as well. A lot of things came back to reality with a bump, and a lot of things changed in that landscape during that time. And with this eclipse today, with the time of recording, Saturn has also gone retrograde into Pisces, and we're being asked to revisit a lot of these themes over the next 6 months or so, So it's kind of kicking off a process where we want to gather together the threads, bundle the sticks, pull all of the different things into a unified, cohesive landscape, or however you want to call it, or perspective or horizon, and allow the things that do not serve, the things that are steering us in the wrong direction or just completely ungrounded, to be let go and taken away, washed away by the tides and ebb and flow of the universal cosmic currents, or however you want to refer to it, So it is a beautiful process and is a beautiful time. And all of this is serving for the higher realization and unfolding of spirituality within the community of humanity. But it's also asking us, well, what's actually grounding for you? What's going to hold water for you? And what's actually going to be the thing that helps you serve, helps you stand up in your path, helps you be that beacon, be that light, be that positive resonator. Because because our Neptune and Saturn story isn't done yet, while, Neptune is going to retrograde into Pisces as well, bringing us more emphasis and reflections as we go through the winter months in the Northern Hemisphere, or the summer months in the Southern Hemisphere. That's teeing us up for when Saturn and Neptune both go back into Aries, which is in February 2026. Now, this is an interesting time, and the vision that I get a lot for Neptune and Aries particularly is like throwing those fish on the barbecue, where we've had that kind of free-flowing, expansive, very much kind of like, let's just see what happens. Now it's about bringing all of that data together, bringing everything that you've learned together so you can create your own sense of practice, your own sense of cosmology, your own sense of a relational spiritual lens that you see through and connect with the world, that's going to serve you and help you serve others and serve the world, serve the community, serve the planet, all of this kind of stuff. Because when these planets go back into Aries, we've got some quite interesting focus on the self. And, with Saturn being a martial energy, it could see a rise in conflict, or at the very least, people going to bat for their beliefs. So while we have this time period of unpacking and unpicking any knots and weaving things together once again, we can see this as like the apex of the great spiritual reset that Saturn in Pisces exemplified for many of us. And it's an interesting thing because I think a lot of folks who built up their sort of station as a practitioner, or their following as a practitioner in the Neptune and Pisces era. So many great practitioners came in that time, but it's like I say, we're looking at a landscape issue here, but many of them became focused on maintaining the structure, that pyramid structure. Yes, we're back there again. Pyramid structures and social hierarchy and the imagined social order. All of this stuff became the focus of what they were trying to hold on to, and using the followings to be weaponized against anyone who detracts or anyone who calls for accountability. And I find that particularly interesting because, again, that speaks to the delusion of the unboundaried Neptune in Pisces. Not that it's all bad, but, we have to look at some of these cultures and practices and perspectives and ideas that have not served us, but are actually serving the individual cause of the practitioner. We can start to pick this apart and we can see it. And like I always say, my areas of observation: spirituality community, self-employed, business owner community, the education community, and the creative, specifically musical, artistic community as well. So looking at those different areas of life, it was interesting to see, all of this wonderful potential collective wave of broadening of the horizon, then getting distilled through the individualist lens, and then Saturn rolling into that archetypal energy of Pisces in the collective unconscious, shaking things up, burning away the crap, and doing all of these different things that actually could be quite challenging. So with that, and looking at that sense of reset and looking at that sense of opening is a really key message, because forewarned is forearmed. And I love that saying, because with astrology and these kind of things, it's never about giving away your power, giving away your agency to what's going on in the sky. It's about looking at how we can make the most of these energies rippling through the collective unconscious, because we are all connected. Everyone is connected. There is a relationship. There is an interdependence. And the more that we adopt that going into the more that we adopt that awareness going into the as yet unwritten future, we can create something much more interesting for everybody to come together and to rally around, especially as a lot of folks who became preoccupied with maintaining their cult of personality and the individualist perspective through this time are the ones who are not in service of the future. They're only in service of themselves. So for those of us who have this mindset, and for those of us who at least have that curiosity, think of it as like, the plant growing through the crack in the concrete. A lot of this stuff is still quite nascent, and in its early stages of reflections, but we really do need to recognize that we have to nurture the seeds of those awareness. And sometimes when you can put ideas out there, you talk about justice, we talk about evolution, we talk about more connected spiritual community and a more consciousness around the ripple effects of what we put out there, and people kick back on it, they are uninviting themselves to the conversation. So try not to get too tangled up in it if you express something and you're met with that pushback, because that is the shift in perspective that we're talking about today, and being in the awareness of that, and then working with that, that bell being rung with the eclipse, and then those reverberations moving out from beyond there. So it's actually quite a special time. It's quite a beautiful time, and it's a time for people to step forward who've maybe felt left out before, or maybe felt marginalized before, but they know that they have something to share, or they know that they're connected. And, I say to all of you folks, like, just don't be shy. Don't be shy. And whenever you see that pushback of this kind of consciousness, know that you're just coming up against that egregore, that conscious thought form that we're all battling with when we want to make progress in society, that has this idea that the individual is God and the apex of everything, which is just you know, there's Hollywood nonsense. It is very problematic for us moving forward, because then what we because then when we realize is we have got that hierarchical model of leadership that we need to move away from as well. We need horizontal leadership where everyone's moving forward together and leaning into their own personal strengths and perspectives and how they can muck in to all of this kind of stuff. So the two phrases I would say here that have been really helpful is letting go and going gently. Because when we let go of something, we don't necessarily just have to drop it and it shatters on the floor. Because a lot of the things that came up through this Neptune in Pisces era, there's a lot of good to them. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. But as we go through these next few months in this period, you might want to look at well, how do you extract the threads of what you think are worth carrying over from this without completely throwing everything in the bin? Something that when we're working with Piscean energy, it is about looking into the nuance of things, because sometimes Pisces can be a little bit out there. And I say this as a Pisces midheaven, and it was the sign I struggled to relate to the most for years, because a lot of Pisces that I met just total washouts, and then the other ones that weren't were just like gold dust. So Piscean energy and me has been a bit of a journey, but because it's my midheaven, that is my my essentially the fingerprint of purpose on the world, which what I'm doing here is a very Piscean thing. Let's be mystical and weird on the internet, but with a higher purpose, so we can get people to come along and enjoy and have their perspectives unfold, and they have that higher realization. We need to recognize that these energies have got polarities. So if we struggle with the Piscean energy and we see it as a bit of a washout and we see it as a bit airy, fairy, flaky, then we're at the lower end of the stick here. And as we move through that spectrum, we go up to the higher end of the stick, we can see a lot of great spiritual insight and connection, a lot of understanding, a lot of awareness of the nuances within others, and then how we can kind of flow within that. So we really have to allow ourselves to look higher, aim higher, and reach within these higher ideas within ourselves. So when we're letting go of these things, there can be this tendency to have this absolute knee jerk. And we did see a lot of spirituality accounts, coaches, creators, practitioners turn away from spirituality and embrace, how shall I put it, a very robust interpretation of Abrahamic religion. I think that would be the fairest way to put it, because one of the downsides of Neptune in Pisces is a lot of people were avoiding shadow work, with this very kind of like love and light version of spirituality in a world that is full of challenges and intersectional challenges at that as well, in that no problem is going to affect the same person in the same two ways. There's going to be nuances, there's going to be different contributing factors. So when we're not addressing the shadow, we're not addressing what could be considered the undesirable parts of the human experience, because so many of us in this world have grown up with a binary idea of what is good and what is bad. On the spiritual journey, on the spiritual path, you will inevitably come up against these parts of yourself. So when you come up against these parts of yourself, what do? You go gently, you go slowly, you allow yourself to really move through at a pace that feels right to you. But if you try and frog march yourself through a practice, or you try and do the whole bro psychedelics thing, which is let's not even get started on that, but the concept of just, yeah, man, I'm going to take this thing and it's going to make me more productive and through that lens of the individual once again, or anything that avoids that personal accountability. This is where we started to see those shifts from that kind of spiritual openness to, no, I am now hardline disciple of, whoever, and everything else is demonic and blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff. These people didn't make the cut, to be a spiritual practitioner. They this is where they had come up against the influence of Saturn that was asking us, does the bucket of your spiritual practice hold water, or does it have holes in the bottom that you need to keep pouring through to maintain the illusion of composition? And all this kind of stuff. And, I find that particularly interesting, and it appealed to my analytical side as an ex-teacher. And, I've spoken so much about my personal spiritual path for our regular listeners, because for me and a lot of the people that I became friends with in the spiritual community, and a lot of the folks who I just naturally resonated with, were people who felt like they were coming up through the cracks of this culture and, felt opposed to it in a certain way, but didn't necessarily want to create something that was oppositional to it. But did want to be responsive and reflective to the fact that maybe we need another evolution here to situate things relevant to the world as they are now, through the lens of social media, that we can share all of these different perspectives and we can know what's going on around the world outside of very tightly controlled narratives that support ideologies and and all this kind of stuff. As you can tell, what I'm driving at here, I'm just trying to do it in a way that is diplomatic, because one of the things that's been coming up for me about the reflection of this Saturnian energy coming back into the lens of Pisces, and then of course Neptune incoming as well, is as much as there is a lot of nonsense in this world, and those who have regressive ideologies and are exploiting the primal emotion of others to push those agendas and get the votes in and all that kind of stuff, they have very strong things to rally around. Whereas those of us who want to have a progressive and inclusive and unfoldingly expansive future do not. And part of the problem with that is we can't agree on how to approach things. But I think, in all honesty, we actually need to focus on the bigger picture and look at how we can create those waves at large while also evolving within ourselves, so we can then have this alignment of different perspectives, rather than trying to argue about, oh, this is the right way, this is the soft way. Nah, we've passed that point, and we need to actually look at, what does society need? What are the mechanisms of community, and how do we create that sense of the connective tissue, which has been slowly eroded by the apparatus of state because it's not profit generating? People like that don't see the value in a community center. They don't see a value in things that somehow don't turn profit, but actually they're the things that have kept communities together and strong. And when we lack these things, it's very easy for populism and fascism to take control, because it thrives on a sense of isolation and alienation. But all it is offering is a Frankenstein's monster of the systems of control and governance and economics that have got us here in the first place. So for me, one of the potential pathways to creating an antidote to this sort of thing is about helping create and foster stronger community. So it's trying to find a way to present these things without dunking on folks that are doing stuff that is, by all accounts, total crazy mental shit, because they are welcome at any moment in time to go, actually, do you know what? This is not right. And come over to that more progressive, inclusive, future-focused, broad landscape, broad horizon, open-minded, not exploited through the primal portal of emotion side of things, And in doing that, we have to find a way to let them know that the door is open, but also that if they're intent on coming in and tracking crap all over the carpets because that's how they express themselves, which a lot of them do, unfortunately, because again, it's primal emotion, very childish, very immediate, then they are not welcome to come in. So we have to look at how we draw the distinctions in this kind of thing, which again, as we're revisiting the lessons of Saturn in Pisces and Neptune in Pisces, it's looking back over that period in time. You know, Neptune and Pisces from 2012, Saturn from 2023. And looking at what's shifted, looking at what's changed, and how we're kind of turning corners into more regressive stuff, and also how we're seeing expansions into the more positive. Because one of the things that we need to recognize is that the regressive stuff is always loud, it's always brash, it is classless, it appeals to the worst of us because all it is the dregs. It has found its way to the top of the tree or the front of the line, shall we say it like that, appealing to the worst in us, driven by the worst in us, and driven by the promise of satisfying individual need, which it cannot. It never will be able to. History has taught us this a number of times, but it looks like we're going to have to learn it again. So when we're exploring this through this lens of gathering up the information, gathering up the different things, I want you to really think about, you know, who do you let into your consciousness? Who do you let into your mind? Who do you let into your awareness that is actually there to support you on the road ahead and is actually there to, you know, help you be yourself and help you expand into that unknown in a way that, you know, recognizes that, yeah, it's scary. Yeah, there's going to be fear. But also, when we're going into the unknown, the clue's in the name, innit? We don't know what's going on. So we have to find that openness. And Saturn in Pisces was asking us, you know, what is all of the good that you've taken from this Neptune transit? How have you allowed yourself to be expanded, where you understand your own energy better, you understand your intuition better, you understand the nature of visions or the nature of mystic work, the multisensory nature of intuition, which we should probably do a few episodes on this one alone, because that's a lot of how I work. You know, and that's a conversation I'm interested in having because it's a skill that we can all develop. You know, it's not some innate thing that only a few people have. You might have it like with anything, you know, some folks have got it latent, but it's open within them, you know, but we can all work at it and learn that landscape, learn that language. So again, as we go through, it allows us to recognize the nature of people that we have chosen to follow or we have allowed to position themselves in front of us and say, is this okay? Is this what we need? Is this driven by openness or is it driven by closedness? You know, these very simple questions that allow us to open up in these various different ways, because one of the things that we should get rid of, or should we get rid of or get away from or allow it to be contextualized and see that it is nonsense, is this idea of looking for a savior. You know, I was having a conversation with someone a little while ago, and we've both had experiences of, I guess, what we would call like extraterrestrial spiritual stuff. You know, again, subject for another time to go in more depth. But they said to me, oh, it looks like all the ET stuff's not going to happen. I'm like, what do you mean? And then they were like, well, no one's coming to save us. And I thought, well, of course no one's coming to save us. The whole point of this stuff is you have the connection, you have the fingerprint, but then we've got to put it into practice ourselves. You know, Saturn in Pisces was asking us, does your spirituality support your agency? You know, and a lot of folks, again, leaning into that narrative of there is a good, there is a bad, there is a savior, there is an enslaver, or however, you know, whatever the opposite of that is. And the more that we do that, the more we give our own power away. So part of this idea of a great spiritual reset is like, yeah, put yourself in the driving seat, man. You know, give yourself the power, give yourself the green light, give yourself that ability to take those steps in your own path without judgment on self, without shame of expressing your light in the world, because people who will push back on that, like I said earlier, if you're pushing for something new in that spiritual awareness, that creative awareness, the social awareness, people who push back on that are too used to the old. Their minds have essentially become quite rigid and locked about what something is supposed to look like. But the people who vibe with it are the people who are on the same trip. It might be a bit fewer and further between, but they are rising. They are opening up. they are starting to make themselves known. You know, a lot of conversations around spirituality have become more commonplace, which was one of the beautiful things about Neptune in Pisces, and then Saturn in Pisces asked us to go deeper with that, you know, and really bring that to the fore. So with this eclipse cycle, Virgo, Pisces, south node, north node, that is really wanting us to bring things in and lock them in, and create more structure, more detail, more logic, more process based stuff, and actually a way that can be bringing this knowledge and insight to the world in a way that makes sense to you, is actionable to help others, either through a direct service or an indirect service, but ultimately helps you elevate and broaden your horizon. So, you know, things are getting real in many respects, but spirituality is that light internally for all of us. And also, it's that light as we go through the cave system. You know, someone once said on one of my lives, "Is like, oh, isn't spirituality just a coping mechanism?" And I was like, well, no, but arguably everything could be a coping mechanism. It depends what you do with it. If you're seeing it in support of your agency and autonomy and the unfolding of your personal journey, it is the opposite of a coping mechanism. It's an empowerment mechanism that allows you to draw power from the seen and the unseen, and see/sense how they are connected and experienced by you through your personal lens. So there's a lot of beautiful stuff here that, when we cut away from those pyramid structures of control and leadership, and when we cut away from the individualist lens, we start to see, oh, all right, okay, this is how all of these different things can be supportive of a broadening of the landscape and horizon for humanity, which, to me, this eclipse is asking us to reflect on these things. And also within that is to help us clear out those things that stand in the way of us embodying that awareness and embodying those insights and embodying our way of moving through the world, because then we've become free. We've allowed ourselves to move forward. We've allowed ourselves to take control of our own selves. And when we put this through the lens of the great spiritual reset, shall we say, is a lot of spirituality had become very dogmatic, and it had become reactive to religion. I know so many people that are religious that embrace the mysticism and embrace the spirituality and embrace the expansion side of it. And while, like, a lot of religion that we see on the internet is driven by this awful rhetoric and this fire and brimstone, and forgetting the fundamental truth that whatever it is out there, however you relate to it, that energy is love, and claiming that people will go to the fiery place if they don't follow it is the opposite of love. That is abuse, you know, and spiritual abuse, religious abuse is one of the great shadows that we have to deal with in humanity. And during this time and this period, we can deal with that within ourselves, because it's very easy for us to fall into that, oh yeah, ooh, this is crap, yeah, everyone's an idiot and all this kind of thing. But we're not allowing ourselves to see, actually, that's probably not the case. And just a lot of these absolute spanners, should we call them, tools, have just got very good at organizing, because they've got those pillars to organize around. So what we have to do is find how this has influenced us, how this is living in our energy, living in our consciousness, living in our bodies through the experience of emotions, because emotions are how we experience energy. And this is how we can do the work to free ourselves. So this is crucial for this idea of a spiritual reset, because then when we're going into Saturn and Neptune in Aries, all of the outer planets are going to be in fire and air signs, you know, because that kicks off in February. Saturn and Neptune, and Uranus is already in Gemini. It's going to regress into Taurus for a bit. Pluto is firmly in Aquarius now, even though at this stage in time Jupiter is transiting Cancer, which is trine this eclipse, giving it that supportive, expansive energy. And I'm kind of like trying to steer us to lean into that side of things. Because again, like I always say, any of the lunations, you feel the ripples effect, you feel the story of that particular lunation for months afterwards. So it doesn't matter if you're like, oh my God, that eclipse was weeks ago or months ago, because we can get into the rhythm at any time. But when we get going next year, Jupiter will transit into Leo as well. So we've got, which that happens around summertime, like June, July. I can't remember the exact date, but the whole sky is going to be fire and air, and you want to be in a position to work with that energy consciously, because that can be very easy for someone to bang the drum and everyone's like, "Rah!" falling in behind it because they have joined that cult, So we want to be really conscious to have that sense of self-awareness and see those levels of connection and recognize where we are being played. Again, these are themes that keep coming up because these are the important themes that if we are going to be free in this life, we've got to be free within ourselves in mind, body, and soul, but we also have to be free within the system because, again, with this individualist mentality and looking things through the hero savior lens, it's like, yeah, everything's going to collapse and a new civilization is going to rise from the ashes. It's like, do you know how crap that would be? Do you know how difficult that would be for so many people? Spirituality that doesn't consider those who are at the bottom lines of society, whether they are being oppressed, whether they are struggling for resources, or just for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. If your spiritual awareness and view for the future doesn't include those people, then it is not spirituality. You've fairy dusted your ego. So we have to recognize that if we've been seeing through things through these lenses of there's a harsh binary of good and evil, or there is, this is bad, this is good, and all of this kind of stuff, we've got some deprogramming to do. We've got some unpicking to do. We've got some rewiring to do with our views and our beliefs and our practices. And this is a good time to do it. So here we go. Allow yourself to engage with this process. Go at the pace that you feel that is right for you. But it's time, man. It's time. It's time for us to create that world. It's time for us to establish what our pillars of rallying round are going to be. It's time to establish, like, how do we connect? How do we get together with others that also share aligned visions? How do we stand for something more positive and start to build up that connective tissue? Start to give society a collagen supplement, which is all like arts, creativity, community organization, actioning, and all of these kind of things. And spiritual awareness and perception is one of the great guiders of this when it comes to how can we do something. We tap into our own intuition, but also as we're going through that reset process and we're unpicking things and we're creating a better sense of flow within us, that allows us to move further, allows us to go more into this. It allows us to start putting things out there and actioning things, because when we're in service of that as yet unwritten future, the undiscovered country, if we're not doing that, it'll be those generations alive that will have the hardest time living in this brave new world. And if we don't, we'll end up in the attempted coup of a very regressive technoligarchy, because technology is there to aid human life and aid our experience. It is not there to be used as a means of power and control over others. But that's where we're going at the minute, because we are not doing the work to deconstruct within ourselves. So this is a really good time, a really good opportunity for those of you who are interested in being that positive influence, being that light, establishing those pillars and allowing things to come together. This is the time. This is the rallying call, my friends, my brothers and sisters and non-gender binary siblings. It's time. Stand up, but you've got to stand up within yourself first. So that's been episode 10 of The Big Soup. I've been Alistair Ballantyne and shall continue to be Alistair Ballantyne after this episode has ended. If you want my help and advice and support on your personal journey of spirituality, growth, expansion, and development and well-being, feel free to head over to my website, alistairballantyne.com, and explore the range of services that I offer for this purpose, where you can have private one-to-one sessions, group sessions, check out my Activating the Inner Magician course, or sign up to one of the lunar circles where we come together and work with the different lunar transits and energies and archetypes as we go through the year. There are plenty of stuff to get involved in to support you and your spiritual agency and growth on the journey and the road ahead. Once again, thank you very much. And I'll see you all in a bit.